assignment. Write a book about San Francisco. So there are these WPA guides about all the major cities of the country, all the states. And then the artists were sent to post offices and schools to paint murals and so forth. But there were many other people besides these who were given jobs because they had some kind of particular skill. My mother-in-law, who had gotten an architecture degree, was hired by the government to do architectural drafting for the Navy. So designing ships. And then one of the biggest projects was the Tennessee Valley Authority, in which had the purpose of revitalizing the South by electrifying the largest section of the country that had inadequate power supplies. And it did this as a government entity. Now, there was a reason why they did it as a government entity. Not because Roosevelt was a socialist, but because the Roosevelt administration looked at the generation of power in the United States and decided that the plants are outmoded and too small for the potential capacity. The electricity utilities pushed back and said, no, they're just perfect for the use of the demand that we have now. We're not going to invest any money in upgrading our power sources. And in most parts of the country, the utilities had monopolies, as on the model of what Samuel Insull had set up in Chicago for ComEd. So the Tennessee Valley Authority was in a sense shock treatment for the utility companies. The government would go in, it would take over the generation and distribution of electricity for a 6-state area, and it would invest heavily in the most up-to-date electricity infrastructure, power generating infrastructure. All around the country, the private utilities took a look at that, and they realized that if they didn't start investing in upgrading their plants, their generating plants, and their systems, they would not be able to compete with government-run power. So they either invested or they would be taken over by one form of government or another, a state government, municipal government. In Los Angeles, the Department of Water and Power took over the city of Los Angeles took over the generation of electricity. So this was a method of forcing businesses who were reluctant to upgrade, do the proper capital investment to upgrade. So how are you going to address the problem of unfair distribution of pain? That is, the virtuous were being punished as hard as the irresponsible. The central act for addressing this problem was the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was the foundation of the first phase of the New Deal, the cooperative phase. It established the National Recovery Administration, which had the authority to set as it says there, fair competition codes for all industries. If you subscribe to the NIRA, if you became a member of the NRA, it was a membership group, then you agreed to abide by the rules that the NRA published. So the NRA would determine how many men's shoes would be produced every year, how many women's shoes. Of those women's shoes, how many would be high heels, how many would be loafers, how many would be mid-size heels, how many would be black, how many would be brown. It would determine what the price of each pair of shoes would be. It would determine the materials and the quality of materials that were to be used. And it would determine the price that the shoe manufacturer would pay the leather manufacturer or the button manufacturer or the shoelace manufacturer. This is in effect socialism, but it's socialism by committee, because there would be committees for each industry run with equal membership by government planners who were supposed to be neutral, and representatives of the industrial manufacturers that were engaged in that industry, and then representatives of labor. Consumers were not represented. This was a big point of complaint from consumer groups who wanted to see consumers at the table. No business was required to subscribe to this. No business had to follow the rules of the NRA guiding its particular business. But if you were not a member of the NRA, if you were not in compliance, then there were all sorts of subtle and not so subtle punishments that would make it increasingly difficult for you to do business. You would be last in line to get, if let's say you're a shoe manufacturer, you would be last in line to get the leather you need, or the rubber you need, or the shoelaces you need. Before you could even make a bid on any of the supplies that you needed, everybody who was actually a member of the NRA would have to have completed their orders. Same thing if you needed a new set of machines. You wouldn't be able to get your machine until your competitors who were in the NRA had gotten their machine. Now, presumably, the only reason you would do this, be outside of it, was because you thought you could do things a little cheaper. But in effect, you would be prevented from functioning at a cheaper rate. And the labor laws would also then come in to prevent you from hiring people at a cheaper rate than what had been established to be a fair wage for your industry. So essentially, market mechanisms were to be completely replaced by a cooperative economy in which the common interest defined what was going on. Now, we might think of this as socialism, but it actually was based on very credible 19th century ideas in the United States and practices that had sort of limited local sway, but had never been extended to the degree that the NIRA was planning. This was a 100% American idea with 100% American roots. But it certainly would have been revolutionary. But it was this law, the NIRA, that the Supreme Court declared to be unconstitutional in every aspect. And with the collapse of this act, which was in effect for 2 years, the cooperative New Deal was no longer feasible because it did not rest on voluntary participation. It rested on coercion. Yeah.
What Supreme Court case made it legal?
It was illegal. It was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. I don't know the name of the case, but it'll be in the Polenberg book. So you can look. There's a long discussion about the NIRA there. Yes?
Did the aesthetics of consumer goods change considerably, considering they were tying up high materials and how much they could use?
At this point, you were just lucky to have shoes. So I think probably, conceivably aesthetics could have been something that would have become factored into the product lines. Certainly the automobile companies were concerned with aesthetics. It was, however, we're still dealing in the culture of standard brands. So any consumer should be satisfied with a limited number of standard products, which are produced in quantity, hopefully to a high level of quality, but maybe not aesthetic quality. In niche marketing, where aesthetics becomes increasingly important, is really comes into its own in the 1960s. Doesn't mean it didn't have a play inside the market prior, but everything was really tamped down by an idea of let's just get some basic products to the public. So, in the 1950s, when I was a kid and you went to the ice cream store, there were never more than 4 flavors. And that was typical. When Baskin-Robbins opened with 32 flavors or something, that was actually a revolution. So was the Depression caused by business being too powerful? This would still be a debate, but these are 2 acts that serve the purpose of reducing the power of business. Part of this, along with this, went the idea of decreasing income inequality, so that the wealth of stockholders and managers, while still significant, would be pushed downwards. And not necessarily in order to pay for pushing the wages up of the lower half of the economy. There was a sense that wage inequality, income inequality, had been a marker of the speculative had been a marker of speculation and had promoted speculative frenzy. It promoted luxury rather than basics, and therefore needed to be kept under control if you were going to keep the economy focused on in continually improving its productive capacity and not getting caught up with glamour and money for the sake of money. So international trade was blocked. Both Hoover and FDR extended federal credits to help foreign customers, particularly in Asia and Latin America, to buy U.S. goods. So in a sense, they financed the resumption of trade. Hoover had been very strong in proposing suspension of payments from debtor countries. He didn't see how outstanding loans could be repaid until the Depression was over and the value of a loan recalculated to something more realistic. And Hoover had proposed the good neighbor policy towards Latin America, which was to end military interventions and supervision of Latin American countries to make sure that they behaved in ways that the United States businesses liked. And Roosevelt continued and expanded that. Roosevelt went further than Hoover by really pursuing a policy of bilateral trade agreements.